Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of Stakeholder Whispering Live. I am very happy to be with you again this week. And you all probably know me by now, but my name is Bill Shander, and I wrote a book called Stakeholder Whispering. And we're here to talk about not the book, but the ideas behind it, which is that our stakeholders don't always know what they need. And our job as knowledge workers is to help them figure it out. So we execute on that instead of what they asked us for, which, sometimes it is what they asked us for, but sometimes it isn't. And that's the key idea, is figuring out what it really is. And I always have a guest with me. And today's guest is Jen Kordell, who comes to us rather, as the Chief Human Resources Officer at Charles River Associates. Jen, thank you very much for being here. And maybe you can do a little bit more of a complete introduction of yourself for everybody.
Sure. Thanks, Bill. I'm really excited to be here. I know we've worked together for at least a decade, it seems like, so I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Sure.
I started my career as a consultant, so definitely right squarely in that knowledge worker, needing to please clients, understand clients, meet their needs. That was the first half of my career. I took a little bit of a career break as I was starting my family, had an opportunity to move abroad, and came back to the firm that I had been a consultant at, but came back on the corporate and management side. I started as in a chief of staff role, doing strategy, management information, reporting, operations, got interested in talent issues, took on recruiting and training responsibilities. And now I've been running all of our human capital team for about 10 years.
That's great. I don't think I even knew that you were a consultant at Charles River
I was,
previously and
yeah,
then came back.
yeah,
All right.
yeah, yeah,
That's great.
yeah.
I know that we chatted a little bit before we started, and I just made the comment that our stakeholders don't always know what they need, and our job is to help them figure out and give it to them. And I know you came armed with a metaphor to describe that. Maybe you can tell people, that sums it up pretty well, I think.
Yeah, I feel like when I read your book, Bill, it like spoke to me about things that I've often thought, which is this idea of not doing exactly what I tell you, but trying to discern what I'm not saying and what I mean. And so the metaphor I've long used is that I might tell you I need a cake, and I might also tell you the recipe. And with my cooking skills, the recipe is very likely to be totally disconnected from what would actually be required to make a cake. And it's important to discern, do I want you to follow my recipe or do I want the cake? And sometimes I need to see both. And sometimes you need to understand that I just want the cake. And sometimes I don't want the cake. I just want you to do what I told me. So figuring that out is important, but more often than not, people want the cake and not the recipe.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And as I mentioned there's a similar metaphor in the book running, the inmates are running the asylum. The inmates are running the asylum by Alan Cooper. And I think the way he phrases it is that, a bag full of flour, sugar, and eggs isn't a cake.
Mhm.
Like
Right,
you go to the grocery store, you get the ingredients, but that doesn't make it a cake or something to
right.
that effect. I did a
Yeah.
horrible job paraphrasing that. Um, so I know you have some stories too. So you said you have some from your early career, and I definitely want to talk about your current role too, because there's some really good insights in there for our audience. But let's start with some of your early career examples of your own experience trying to whisper your stakeholders.
Yeah, for sure. So one of them, and part of the reason I noted the consulting experience is because one of them does come from a time when I was a consultant and I was working with somebody. I was sort of a mid-level manager. We were working with a client. I also had my own manager who was the officer, the senior person on the job, and we were going to a meeting in which the client was going to go over a number of topics that they were interested in. And I went to that client site. I arranged a time a few days before and spent probably 2 or 3 hours just walking through the questions that they were going to have. And I took a bunch of notes and I went home. I actually remembered, I don't, I think I pulled an all nighter that night to sort of get ready for everything, pulled a bunch of charts and data together to try to be responsive to the things that the client wanted. And it seemed so we then walk into the meeting with my boss and with our clients and me, and the clients, what I in hindsight was very predictably, they started going through their list of 10 questions again. But because I had had that preparation conversation, I was able to immediately pull out a chart. They would say question number one, and I'd say, well, actually, I prepared a chart that shows what you're looking for. Question number two, well, I have a table that speaks to this. Well, question number three, I have this. And by about 4 or 5, everybody started laughing. And they were sort of saying like, oh, can you, joking with each other, can you tell her to be a little less prepared? Can you tell her not, and we walk out, and my manager said, that was amazing. You made us look great. And I sort of felt like, wow, that really felt like cheating, because I went there yesterday. They told me what they were going to ask. All I did was
Right.
prepare. But what I sort of realized is that for whatever reason, they maybe hadn't expected me to prepare. My boss didn't know. And so I felt like I had somehow cheated, like I had impressed, but I hadn't really been brilliant in the moment. I had done a lot of the hard work beforehand. And so I think the lesson is, when there are things that people want and you want to really delight them, it isn't about being brilliant in the moment. Like, your brilliance is not how well you can improvise and wing it in the moment. There's a lot of work that goes into understanding people's needs. And in this case, it was a pretty straightforward example. They sort of told me what their questions were, but I also knew what was important to my manager, and trying to anticipate the kinds of things that would help us look good. And there was a ton of hard work in that 24 hours that led up to that. So I think
Yeah.
that's really key, is that preparation and context, and using all your resources and getting ready to have a stakeholder whisper conversation. You might not be able to predict exactly how things are going to be in the moment, but the phrase, you increase your surface area for luck if you've done that work in advance. And it isn't cheating, and it isn't undermining how smart you are. It's actually enhancing it.
Yeah, I think there's two really important lessons in there. One is exactly what you're talking about. That there's preparation. Even in this case where you heard the questions ahead of time, you still have to interpret what those questions really mean. What do they really need from, in your answers? And you pulled out the right chart, not the 72 charts that could have been not the answers that they really were needed for those questions. And the second lesson is, you mentioned early on, you're going to a client, and consultants, you have a client who's the ultimate stakeholder. They're the one paying the firm to accomplish X. You also have your boss, and your boss, who's like the partner, whoever who sort of has that relationship. Your boss has a different need than the client, but of course they're all aligned. But sort of, managing those two stakeholders is a whole nother thing. Now, in this case, it sounds like you did your work and you just made your boss happy because you were so prepared and the client was happy. But there are some cases where it's not quite so simple, right?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll give another example of maybe not so simple, which is, once I then moved to the corporate side, I started to have internal clients. So I was a corporate person, but I was supporting our consulting staff, who themselves now were the external people. I was sort of the back office.
Yeah.
And I remember a situation with one very difficult stakeholder, very demanding, very short attention span. And I had a friendly enough sort of social casual relationship, but I was being called on to actually deliver some work for this person. And I got a very sort of curt email dismissing what I had been proposing, or the question I had asked. And I had a choice to make in that moment, which was, do I have a point of view? Do I think my point of view is the right thing for the organization? And what are the ways that I can use to move this person in that direction? And so I'm reminded of something that one of my colleagues has recently said, which is, in order to have influence, you have to have access in the relationship, and you have to have a point of view. And I took a bold step, and I asked a provocative question, and I asked it in a kind, professional way, but I pushed. And in that brief moment, I got his attention because I was willing to challenge the conventional wisdom. And I sort of let him know that I've also thought about his problem. And I tried to do it in a way that made him feel like I was laying awake at night thinking about your problem, because that shows that we're on the same team trying to tackle a problem. I'm not trying to be adversarial, but I
Yeah.
wasn't, I wanted to push him further because I didn't think that what he was asking for was correct. And so that was another example of being a little bit bold, but drawing again, like I'm drawing on things that were set up in the past to be successful in this moment, because we did have a bit of a social relationship, and I also understood the issues really well. And so I was well prepared and in a position to have that relationship and to have a point of view and to be able to then to be a little bit more provocative, but again, in a way that aligns me with him against a problem as opposed to an adversarial way.
Yeah. I assume you've had the experience where you had a similar situation and it didn't go so well, or because
Yeah.
sometimes no matter how solid the relationship is, no matter how well you know their thing, depending on the personality of the person on the other side, yeah, it doesn't always go so smoothly. So have you had
Yes.
that experience? And if so, how did you
Oh,
handle that?
absolutely. And I will say this, I'm going to talk a little bit about my own boss, who's the CEO of our company. So anybody who knows will very quickly know who this is. But we have an excellent relationship, and we've worked together very closely for over a decade. Um, but there are days where he just wants what he wants. And this
Yeah,
happened recently. I put together some material and it wasn't quite responsive to what he had asked for. And he said nicely, but you're not listening to me and I want something. And in this case, actually, he was right. Like I put it together. I was like, oh yeah, this is really actually the better way.
yeah,
Or it adds value that I hadn't seen. And that's where I think, and you touch on this in the book, it's really tricky because you have to have a lot of humility in stakeholder whispering, because sometimes people really do have greater experience and greater wisdom, or they have a perspective that isn't, you just don't have access to, or you don't have all the information. And so I think,
yeah,
my boss will often say, and I think it's a good point, give me what I ask for and give me something else. Don't make it either or. Don't fight me, because maybe I am right and maybe I do know what I want. And the reason I'm shutting down this conversation is because I'm actually correct in what I'm seeking. So that
yeah,
humility and that willingness to be experimental with what you're providing and not get stuck on one way or the highway, I think is really important, especially in repeat relationships, because
yeah.
which many of these are, because you do have to have that trust over time in order to keep that, like I said, that relationship and that influence.
Yeah, it is so hard. This book, it's a very interesting topic in that I've never heard many people talk about this idea that our stakeholders don't know what they need and our job's to sort of pull it out of them.
Mhm.
But I did try to say, as to some degree in the book, that yeah, like you have to have that humility because yes, sometimes they're right. Often they aren't, and I'm not going to say the majority of the time. Oftentimes they don't know exactly what they need, and our job is to help figure it out with them. But sometimes they do know exactly what they need, and we have to help them get there. And the phrase that I've used in my career for my entire career is, my clients pay me to tell them no once. Like, you want, X, maybe you should consider Y instead. No, I really want X. Well, are you sure that, and you should do it 2 or 3 times. But then, yeah, I believe you now, client. I'm going to give you exactly what you asked for, and hopefully it's the right choice.
Mhm.
Um, and I know that, now in your current role, you are a C-level person, right? You are the boss
Yes.
of the boss of the boss. You also have a boss, like we all have stakeholders. But
Yes.
so you're on the other side of the fence. People are whispering you, and I know you had some things to share. And I have to say that the question I get most often from people who hear me talk about the book, or even when I'm just teaching about data storytelling and visualization, it's always the question is, how do I talk to my boss about this stuff? How do I actually get this? How do I help them in the most effective way? So, you being on the other side of that table, I think is so there's going to be some very helpful insights to share with our audience. So, yeah, I'd love to hear what you have to
Yeah.
say about that.
Great. Yeah. I had two, as I've reflected on this, I had two insights. One is, I think what, and they're sort of different audiences. One is when it's people who are more junior, but maybe within the organization, who are sort of whispering up to me or managing up to me. I
Mhm.
think one of the things that I always appreciate from that conversation is when there's curiosity and a sense that there might be information that they don't have or that I have. Again, sort of this point with my boss, and that was the mistake I fell into, was thinking I knew everything, right? But
Right.
it's important to really be, and you talk about this in the book, to be genuinely curious, and not just curious with an edge, like, don't you think, which is a way of saying I know I'm right and you're wrong, but to genuinely
Yeah.
say, what are you looking at that I don't see? What makes you think this? Because then we're pooling our information, and maybe together, maybe it's not your way or my way, but a third way, and we might get to a better outcome. So
Yeah.
I always, and that gets easier as you ascend, I have found, because when you're more junior in your career, you feel like you have a lot to prove. And so it's hard to let go of being right. I feel very comfortable now in my career not having answers and asking questions and not always knowing where it's going to lead me, because I am confident in my position and I'm confident in my ability to react in the moment and take in information and keep in mind where I'm going. That's
Yeah.
really hard when you're junior and you feel like you're trying to show how capable you are. So I understand that. But being genuinely curious, I guess I would say, is sort of what I appreciate on the other side of that. That's within my organization. The other times that I feel like I'm whispered to is we work with a lot of vendors. And I'm actually working with somebody now who, and we've spent a lot of time really trying to establish our objectives about a program and trying to align about what it is that we're trying to accomplish. I actually do this internally too. I'll often put together guiding principles for a project, things that can serve as anchors or touchstones up front that we can then keep referring back to. And I'll say, as a stakeholder, part of the reason I resist that, it is so time consuming to do it well. And I have
Yeah.
other things that I'm focused on. You touch on this in the book, I think, in a really nice way. Like sometimes you might have the right answer. I think there was an example where somebody knew it was the wrong it was a mistake, and you were advising them to do something different, but they're like, the risk is low and I don't have time to give this the attention it needs because I have other priorities. So that's the reason I would say I resist when I'm encountering a vendor who's trying to sort of work with me, is I might have a different cost benefit analysis about how much time this project needs from me and what I can afford to give it given my other priorities and where this falls.
Yeah.
And so that tends to be, I think, and I'd be curious, Bill, because you also sell into organizations. So I'd be curious if you even zoom out and have those conversations. Like, how does this fit into the other things that you're thinking about with your organization? Because then I can scope, maybe it's not worth your time to really scale to the right answer. Maybe 80% will be fine given how this fits in.
Yeah, always. In fact, especially back in the old days when I used to do a lot of project work, a lot of technical project work, I was doing web design and development and creating interactive experiences, etc. And the question would always come down the pike at some point, like, oh, we can either engineer this incredibly perfectly and it's going to be, it can handle a bazillion users and it'll never go down, or I could just throw some code together. It'll work, but boy, if more than 100 people touch it at a time, it's going to be a disaster. And neither one of those answers is right or wrong. It depends
Mm-hmm.
on cost benefit, time, risk,
Right.
and all those other things you just mentioned. And so those conversations are key because the quote unquote wrong answer might completely be the right answer in
Right.
different circumstances. And yeah, you have to always have that balanced perspective in place.
Right. Right. And I think what's important is for the vendor, the person who's trying to whisper to the stakeholder, to understand which world you're in. Are you in sort of I'm okay with a lesser solution and making some trade-offs, or this has very high stakes and so I'm willing to invest the time up front, because nothing is more frustrating on the receiving end than having that mismatch of where you're
Yeah,
willing to spend the time or not. In this particular example that I have in mind, we're spending a lot of time up front. It's very high stakes, so it's very worthwhile. But
yeah,
it's very time consuming to get those kinds of things right and to build the kind of alignment for bigger projects that needs to be built. So,
yeah. No, that's so true.
yeah.
You alluded to something a moment ago. You said, it's easier to do this later in your career. You have more confidence. You've gained more trust from your stakeholders. Just the gray hair
Yeah.
allows people, they assume you know what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
what about the more junior people? So what's your advice to, early career person? Because they still need to do this. They need to understand that their stakeholders want a cake, not necessarily the recipe that they've asked for, but they
Yes.
do have to balance that against that. It's going to be harder for them. So
Yeah.
Any gray area advice you can give them?
Yeah, I would say my biggest advice, and where I feel like many people I see and sort of advise over the course of my career, is it really comes down to the preparation in many ways. I'll give one more example. This was maybe about 8 years ago. I was going to be running a review session, and it was with people that I didn't know very well. And we had a mutual contact that I knew very well and trusted. And I actually spent 45 minutes and I called him and I said, give me the lay of the land. Like, what am I not? What are the unspoken things going on in the room? Where are these people coming from? What should I be interpreting? If there's silence, what does that mean? So I tried to really use not just my data and sort of passive resources, but to have conversations that would help me understand people better, because a lot of it does come down to reading social cues, interpersonal effectiveness, reading the room. I mean, a lot of those emotional intelligence skills, but there's so
Yeah.
much that preparation can get you so far and practice. Like, so that's maybe one bucket is prepare. The
Yeah.
second thing is I like to have a few stock phrases. This sounds so corny, but I prepare saying them. So I'll say out loud often, I'd like to just reflect on what you're saying for a minute, which buys me some time to sort of figure out what's my next move and to pause and think. But
Yeah.
if you're not prepared with those stock phrases, you can be taken by surprise and caught off guard. So having that ready to say, or to be able to say, this is going in a different direction and I don't want to waste your time. I am not prepared. Can I prepare and I'll get back to you in 4 hours or tomorrow morning? Those
Yeah.
kinds of phrases, like, have them at the ready and actually practice saying them out loud so that they can come out more naturally, is
Hmm.
maybe a second piece of advice. And the third is being willing, if you're being willing to pause and ask questions. So if you're starting to feel, and I can see it in myself, like if I start to feel a little tense, or like we're in a debate or an argument, I will actually try to pause and say, let me ask a question here, because I feel like maybe you're feeling more strongly about this than I realized. What is it that can you say more about where you're coming from, so that
Yeah.
I'm showing an interest and a curiosity that builds trust, but it also gives me information. Because if somebody's not agreeing with me, then I have to assume, unless they're a complete idiot, like there's something they're seeing that I'm not seeing. So what
Yeah.
is that? And let me find that out. And so that would be sort of my third, is having that ability to pause. Most people like to talk about what's important to them and where they're coming from. So I feel like that kind of question has always been well received, even with my most difficult stakeholders. If I say, you wow, this I seem to have tripped on something, like what's going on for you right now? I mean, you say it maybe in a way that feels natural, but
Yeah.
that's been my third piece of advice.
That's all really good advice. And the third piece is so important. And that one also has sort of two perspectives on it. One, yeah, good open-ended questions like that. Okay, can you say that in a different way? Tell me what you mean by that, etc. Yeah, now they're rephrasing themselves. That you're going to build understanding, etc., which is so key. And it helps trigger in their own minds. They're going to think about it slightly differently. And by explaining it again in this way, and that way, and this way, it's going to help them see their own ideas in a new perspective, which is a key part of stakeholder whispering. And it's also like the mirror of a technique that I recommend in the book, which is that when you're listening to people and asking them questions, that you rephrase what they've said
Mhm.
in a new way to prove that you're listening, but
Yes.
also to, because then it's something for them to react to and say, well, no, I didn't quite mean it like that, or yeah, that's exactly it. And yeah, that technique of rephrasing, translating is so key on both sides of that table.
Yes. And I will say too, as being, like, we've talked a bit about what it's like to be on the more senior end, I will always respect a question that says, can you say a little bit more about that? That is
Yeah.
infinitely better than somebody persisting in their line of argument that is both wrong, and now they've just showed me they're not willing to listen. And
Yeah.
that will shut down things faster than, if I don't have time to keep talking about it, I'll say I can let me get you some material, or I'll reschedule. But um, it's much better to ask, if there's any points you're unsure of or just want more alignment.
Yeah. This is fantastic. Jen, I know that you have a meeting coming up, so I'm not going to keep you any longer. I want to thank you very, very much for being here. I think your perspectives, both as the whisperer and the whisperee, are invaluable, and I'm sure a lot of people will have learned much from hearing you speak. So thank you so much for being here.
Great. Bill, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Excellent. And for everybody watching, I'll be back again next week with another episode. So see you all then. Bye.
Bye.